Welcome to Mindful Moments, where we nourish your mind on the go. We're using AI narration to bring you key insights from all sorts of fascinating topics, perfect for busy folks like you who are always on the move but still want to learn new things. Today, we're going deep, doing a deep dive into a collection of texts that might just completely change how you think about the history of Christianity.
Absolutely. We're going to be talking about the Nag Hammadi Library. It's this incredible collection of ancient manuscripts. And you know what? They were actually hidden away for almost 1,600 years.
Wow, 1,600 years. That's a long time. Okay, so just imagine this. A farmer in Egypt just digging for fertilizer. I mean, who would have thought? He stumbles upon a jar, and inside, you guessed it, these ancient writings. That's how the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945. It's a discovery that sounds like something right out of an Indiana Jones movie.
It really does. And you know, these texts are actually Coptic translations, so they were translated from even older Greek writings. Most likely, they date all the way back to the 2nd century. What's fascinating is that they give us a glimpse into a time when early Christianity was full of debate and diversity.
This is where it gets really interesting, for me at least. The Nag Hammadi Library contains Gospels. We all know about the Gospels, but these are attributed to figures like Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene. And if you know the Bible, you know that these voices are totally absent from the New Testament.
Exactly. And these Gospels present a perspective known as Gnosticism. It's a different way of looking at Jesus' teachings. You see, instead of the traditional focus on sin and repentance, they emphasize self-knowledge and inner transformation.
That's so interesting. So, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is quoted as saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." It's like this focus on realizing your own inner potential. And that really contrasts with the idea of external salvation that you often find in the New Testament.
Gnosis actually means knowledge. It's the core of these texts. The Gnostics believed that salvation comes from recognizing your true divine nature. They believed it was about an internal awakening, not about external forces or rituals.
This difference in thinking really becomes clear when you start to look at the resurrection.
Oh, absolutely. The Nag Hammadi texts show this real clash between traditional Christian beliefs and Gnosticism when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus.
I mean, we've all heard the traditional view, right? Jesus was physically resurrected.
Yeah.
But the Gnostics, they had a completely different interpretation.
For them, the resurrection was a spiritual event. It wasn't about the body. It was about an awakening to that inherent divinity that we were just talking about.
So how did these different interpretations shape the power dynamics in the early church?
Well, as Orthodox Christianity, as the traditional view gained influence, they really started to emphasize the authority of the church hierarchy. You know, the bishops, the priests, all that. These figures were seen as the crucial link between God and humanity.
And this hierarchical structure, it was directly tied back to their belief in a bodily resurrected Christ.
Exactly. They believed that because these church leaders were descended from the apostles who had witnessed the resurrected Jesus, they had this special authority. They believed it had been passed down directly to them.
But it sounds like the Gnostics weren't really into just blindly following those in power.
No, not at all. For them, it was all about gnosis, that personal, direct knowledge of the divine. It was that inner knowing, that awakening to one's true nature. That's what they believed was most important, not external authority.
So it wasn't about your family tree in the church or your position, but more about the depth of your personal spiritual understanding.
Precisely. And this difference in views on authority is so key to understanding these early Christian communities, the struggles they faced. And it all comes down to how they saw authority and where they placed the emphasis. You know, when you really look closely at the Nag Hammadi Library, one of the things that really stands out is how it challenges traditional ideas about authority in early Christianity.
Yeah, we touched on this a bit earlier, right, with that clash between the Orthodox Church and its structure, and then the Gnostic emphasis on individual experience. But can you, break down the real practical differences in how they viewed authority?
Well, as the Orthodox Church became more and more organized, they really leaned heavily on this chain of command. They traced their lineage back to the apostles, claiming that direct line to those who actually witnessed the resurrected Christ.
So their authority was based on a physical connection to the resurrected Jesus, which makes sense given how important the bodily resurrection was to them.
Exactly. This idea of apostolic succession, it really became the foundation for their idea of legitimate leadership. So, for instance, bishops derived their authority from this unbroken chain going all the way back to those original apostles.
But it sounds like the Gnostics weren't too keen on just blindly following leaders.
Not at all. They put the emphasis on gnosis, Remember that personal, direct knowledge of the divine. They believed that this inner knowing, this awakening, was far more important than any external authority.
So it wasn't about who your ancestors were or your position in the church. It was about how deep your spiritual understanding was.
Exactly. And this difference becomes so clear when you look at the texts themselves. The Orthodox Church, you see, they championed the four Gospels of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the only true scriptures. Their argument was that these Gospels were written by the apostles or their close followers, which gave them that undeniable authority.
But the Gnostics, they didn't just stick to those four Gospels, right?
No way. The Nag Hammadi library includes a whole bunch of different Gospels and other writings. Many of them offer different interpretations of Jesus' teachings, or even focus on figures who are totally absent from the New Testament.
Like Mary Magdalene, for example.
Exactly. Her gospel gives us a unique perspective on Jesus' relationships with his disciples. It's amazing how these Gnostic texts challenge that single traditional narrative that we often get about early Christianity.
So with these different views on authority, what were the real-world consequences of that?
Well, the Orthodox Church, with their top-down structure, they really wanted to unify the Christian movement under a single doctrine and leadership. They had this one true church mentality.
Like bringing everyone under their umbrella.
Exactly. They labeled anyone with differing opinions as heretics, and those who held these different views were often pushed out or even persecuted.
And the Gnostics, with their emphasis on personal experience and direct access to the divine preft, they were seen as a threat to this centralized power structure.
Absolutely. If the Gnostic approach had become widespread, it could have completely undermined the power that the Orthodox Church was trying to build.
It makes you think how different the history of Christianity might have been if those Gnostic ideas had taken root.
It's a fascinating thought, but even though those Gnostic texts were ultimately suppressed by the Orthodox Church, they still give us this incredibly valuable glimpse into an early Christian landscape that was way more diverse and dynamic than we often imagine.
They remind us that even within religion, there are always different ways of seeing things, different interpretations, and that those power struggles are always present.
Precisely. And that awareness, the ability to look at things with a critical eye, is so important for anyone who wants to understand the complexities of religious history.
So in a way, the Nag Hammadi library, even though it was suppressed, it encourages us to think for ourselves, to question what we're told, and to be open to other viewpoints.
You got it. It's a call to engage with history, and that includes religious history with a critical mind, recognizing that there's rarely just one absolute truth.
This ties back to that Gnostic emphasis on gnosis, right? On seeking knowledge directly rather than blindly accepting what authorities tell you.
Exactly. The Nag Hammadi texts might have been pushed aside by the rise of the Orthodox Church, but they still offer this powerful reminder of the importance of seeking truth from within through your own experiences and insights.
It seems like there's a lesson here for us today that goes beyond just religion.
Absolutely. We live in a world bombarded with information and conflicting narratives. Being able to think critically, to question what you hear, and to seek deeper understanding is more important than ever. So as we dig deeper into the Nag Hammadi library, it becomes clear that one of the biggest differences between the Gnostic and Orthodox Christians was how they understood what it means to be human, like what it means to be a person.
Right. We've already talked about how they interpreted Jesus' teachings differently and the resurrection. But how did their views on human nature actually differ?
Well, the Orthodox Church, they kind of built on traditional Jewish teachings, and they really emphasized the concept of sin. They saw sin as the main thing separating us from God.
That idea of falling short of God's expectation.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole idea of sin, it really influenced how they saw salvation. They believed that humanity needed to be redeemed, saved from the consequences of sin.
And that's where Jesus comes in, right, as the Savior.
Exactly. For Orthodox Christians, Jesus' death and resurrection were a sacrifice, a way to atone for the sins of all humanity and restore our relationship with God.
But it sounds like the Gnostics didn't really see it that way.
Nope, not really. They had a very different perspective. Instead of sin, they focused on ignorance as the root of human suffering.
Ignorance of what exactly?
Ignorance of our true nature, that divine spark that's within each of us. For Gnostics, salvation wasn't about being saved from sin. It was about awakening to that inherent divinity.
So it was more about self-discovery than about being redeemed by something outside of yourself.
Exactly. And this difference in thinking led to very different approaches to spiritual practice. The Orthodox Church stressed faith, obedience, and participating in the sacraments as the means to salvation.
So a focus on rituals and doctrines.
Yes, but the Gnostics, they placed more value on personal experience, on seeking knowledge directly through introspection, meditation, and mystical practices.
Looked like they were looking for that inner enlightenment, that direct connection.
Right. And this emphasis on personal experience resulted in a more individualistic approach to spirituality, which really contrasted with that communal hierarchical structure of the Orthodox Church.
So we can see how this fundamental difference in how they understood human nature played out in their beliefs, their practices, and even in how they organized themselves.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating look at how different ways of seeing the world can lead to very different ways of expressing religious faith.
It makes you wonder, with such different perspectives, how did each of them view suffering?
That's a great question. For the Orthodox, suffering was often seen as a direct consequence of sin, like a punishment for straying from God's path.
But it could also be seen as a test of faith, right away, to become more pure.
Yeah, that's another important piece. Suffering could be a way to prove your devotion to God, to show that you were worthy of salvation.
And this idea of martyrdom, enduring suffering and even death for your beliefs, that became a big part of Orthodox Christianity.
Exactly. It was the ultimate act of faith, showing you identified with Christ's sacrifice and proving your commitment to the Christian message.
But the Gnostics, they didn't seem as into suffering, did they?
Not really. While some Gnostic texts do acknowledge suffering and even encourage believers to withstand persecution, others kind of downplay its importance. Some even reject it completely.
Really? How so?
Well, some Gnostics saw suffering as an illusion, a result of ignorance and being too attached to the material world. They believed that true enlightenment meant rising above suffering and achieving a state of spiritual liberation where pain and hardship couldn't touch you.
So their focus was on that internal change more than on external challenges.
Exactly. They emphasized finding inner peace and detachment, realizing that the material world is temporary and that suffering is ultimately an illusion.
This has been an incredible journey into the Nag Hammadi library. We've explored these alternative views on Jesus' teachings, the resurrection authority, and even the nature of what it means to be human.
It's truly amazing how these ancient texts, hidden for so long, can still challenge our assumptions and give us new ways of seeing the origins of Christianity and how it developed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest lesson from the Nag Hammadi library is that history, especially religious history, it's never simple. It's never black and white. There were always different perspectives and interpretations back then, and there were always struggles for power. It's not accurate to think of the early church as one unified group.
It's so easy to get caught up in that simplified narrative, but the Nag Hammadi texts really show us that there was so much more going on.
Exactly. The Nag Hammadi texts paint this incredibly complex and diverse picture of early Christianity, one that really challenges our assumptions and encourages us to look at history in a more nuanced and critical way.
And that willingness to question what we think we know, to consider other viewpoints, that's so important for anyone who wants to really understand the past and see how it connects to our lives today.
Absolutely. The Nag Hammadi library, despite being suppressed, is this powerful reminder that truth is rarely just one-sided. There's so much value in exploring those different voices, those dissenting views, and those alternative narratives that haven't gotten as much attention.
It's a reminder to think for ourselves, to question what we're told, and to be open to the incredible richness and diversity of human experience, even when it comes to religion.
For anyone who's interested in diving deeper into these ideas and learning more about the Gnostic perspective, I highly recommend Elaine Pagels' book, The Gnostic Gospels. It's a really well-written and accessible exploration of the Nag Hammadi library and what it reveals about early Christianity.
You can find a link to buy the book in the episode description. And of course, if you're looking for more thought-provoking content like this, make sure to subscribe to the Mindful Moments channel.
We're always exploring new ideas and uncovering hidden truths, and we'd love for you to join us on this journey of discovery.
Until next time, keep those minds nourished.